So this area, dominated by the strange brooding presence of Pendle Hill, was almost beyond the back of beyond. And today it's established an odd kind of niche by trading on its dark past. Our intimate knowledge of this dark corner of Lancashire is a result of a remarkable book of trial transcripts published immediately after the conclusion of the Lancaster trials of 1612, which have become known the world over as the Pendle Witch Trials. The transcript provides us both with first-hand testimony from those involved, but also the social, political and religious values of the day, as well as attitudes towards women at that time. Attitudes that could quickly turn into a deadly threat. "Get out of my ground, whores and witches! I will burn one of you and hang the other." So said Richard Baldwin. He's a miller, and is reputed to have called this out to some unwelcome visitors to his mill house. The subjects of his angry words were Elizabeth Southerns, also known as Old Demdike, an old woman of around 80 years, and her granddaughter, Alison Device. "Revenge thee, either of him, or his," the aged woman uttered in reply. She later confessed that these words were spoken to a spirit familiar named Tib. The day after this angry exchange, the miller's daughter fell ill, and a year later she died. In 1612, Elizabeth Southerns, her granddaughter, and countless others in the forest of Pendle found themselves accused of witchcraft. And by summer of the same year, Elizabeth Southerns had died in prison, whilst her daughter and two of her grandchildren had been sent to the gallows. Now, academic study of the history of witchcraft accusations has already painted a vivid picture of the sorts of women that were vulnerable to the cry of witch. Those who were impoverished and living on the edge of the community. Those who dabbled in herbal medicine. Those who were widowed. Such women were often regarded as suspicious, malevolent and dangerous. However, the miller's choice of his words, his furious blending of insults, which suggest both sexual promiscuity and devilish practices, underscore a theme which is prevalent throughout the story of the Pendle Witch Trial in 1612. His association of these two words, although doubtless uttered angrily in the heat of the moment, nonetheless betray a psychological link between two forms of unacceptable and threatening behaviour: witchcraft and female sexuality. Now, a close examination of some of the women caught up in the 1612 trials reveals that in the early modern period, perceptions of their sexual behaviour were used to both ridicule and condemn them, contributing to the idea that these women pose a danger to their communities. One of the whores to whom Richard Baldwin referred was probably Elizabeth Southerns, Old Demdike. We know from the evidence given at the trial she had two children, Elizabeth Device and an older son called Christopher Holgate. By 1612, Elizabeth was an elderly widow. Her husband, Thomas Ingham, was long deceased, and it seems likely that her elder child, Christopher, was born out of wedlock prior to a marriage in 1563. So if this was the case, this would have been well known around the small communities of Pendle, and a source of gossip at the time, and for many years to come, recalled easily to mind as it was by the miller during that angry exchange, that everybody kind of knew about the status of Elizabeth, that she was second rate, third rate, lower still. And to the further detriment of the family reputation, her daughter, Elizabeth Device, appears to have followed suit. Elizabeth married John Device in 1590, and together they had 3 children, James, Alison and Henry, who died in childhood. Now John Device seems to have died in 1600, and in the same year Elizabeth gave birth to another daughter, Janet. So whilst it's kind of mathematically possible just for Janet to have been John's child, it does seem more likely that the child was product of an extramarital affair. And certainly this seems to have been the sort of prevalent belief amongst their neighbours. So kind of like mother, like daughter, here we go again, another illegitimate child. And when kind of questioned by the local Justice of the Peace, Roger Nowell, in spring 1612, Elizabeth confessed she had bewitched John Robinson to death because the said Robinson had chidden and becalled her for having a bastard child with one seller. So seller being, mobile kind of salesperson. So it does seem that she's kind of recognising the kind of reputational slur. In 1612, mother, daughter and grandchildren lived together in an isolated cottage teetering on the edge of dire poverty, with a substantial part of their small income coming from begging. Though the insults and mockery levelled at them but from their neighbours, we can see a picture emerging of an undesirable family, and the emphasis placed upon their sexual morality plays a significant part in this. If they were so morally bankrupt that they would lie with men outside of marriage, that they bore illegitimate children, just what else were they capable of? So how exactly did they ensnare these men? Was it their feminine wiles, or something altogether more malign? We can imagine the kind of gossiping tongues wagging. So let me now give you a second VT of where we think their home is likely to have been based. So the name of old Demdike's house was Malkin Tower. And it sounds really grand, but it wasn't. Malkin was actually a 17th century word meaning slattern or slut, and it was still used in these parts in the 20th century. The house was, and even less grandly, referred to as Mockin Tower. And according to some people, not too fine a point on it, mockin is a local word for shit. So nobody knows for sure where the house would have stood, but recent research suggests it may well have been on this site. So Janet and her family got by mostly through begging and doing odd jobs for neighbours. But the family did have one other source of income, and I suppose a kind of power. Janet's grandmother was well known locally as a cunning woman, and everyone knew her as Old Demdike. So, do we know about cunning women? Don't chuck them up if you have any idea what a cunning woman did in kind of years gone by. It was actually an incredibly kind of valuable role in society, especially for kind of poor people who didn't have recourse to doctors. And there's all sorts of kind of modern roles rolled up into one. So I'm just going to wait for a second, just see if anybody can kind of come through with what they think the sort of roles a cunning woman would do in one of these kind of isolated, poor communities. I'm quite sure how far behind the chat is, but do take a moment. I'm sure you've got some kind of ideas. So we're thinking about within a rural community. Herbal medicines, thank you, Linda. That is definitely one of them. So again, obviously they're starting to come in. Herbalist, perfect, Dawn. Yep, you're absolutely right. So these are, with folk healer, perfect, KCM, yeah. So these are women that are sitting outside any qualifications for a mo. They ain't licensed, they're not supported, they're not recognised by the outside world, by the professions. But within their communities, they might carry out the functions of a policewoman, a social worker, a doctor, a midwife, all those things that give kind of people security about their otherwise kind of anxious lives. But it's a rather, spells absolutely right, because it's rather ambiguous. Because to be a cunning woman would be something the authorities would describe as witchcraft. So cunning women can get into trouble with the law if they fall out with their clients. So that kind of gives you, I think, a sense of the danger, if you like, the jeopardy of this lifetime. I wonder how many out of wedlock births result of sexual assault, says Sue in Oklahoma. It's a great question. It's one that we're not going to know, but I think what is certainly clear, and we can be aware that, I mean, within marriage at least, you know, the woman was the possession of a husband, and that included, you know, absolutely subjecting to any form of kind of sexual behaviour that he so wished. She had no recourse. So I think it's very, very likely those attitudes would bleed outside the marriage bedroom, and to the broader attitude towards women would be that in the minds of a lot of men that they were kind of fair game. They were available. So to Janet, and I found that Janet is the little girl that was born, we know, illegitimately, or we think born illegitimately. It was a kind of fact of life that a person might have the power to heal or harm through the use of charms or spells. To them, it kind of wasn't mumbo jumbo. It was real. It happens. Okay? Witches are people that do bad things. Cunning women are people who do good things. So you kind of see, you know, what's at play here. You know, we've got, in essence, two sides of the same coin, you might say, right? So a cunning woman could cure you and find your lost stuff. Witches could steal stuff from you and make you sick and kill you. So we're really kind of talking about two sides of the kind of same coin, the yin and yang, if you like, of this. So what it does make it is it makes them incredibly vulnerable. Whilst they've got this status within the communities whereby, because of the nature of their functions, being a midwife, you know, attending to sick and this, that and the other, they're able to, you know, perform a role and earn some money. It can turn on a sixpence, as they say. This kind of suddenly accusations fingered pointed and so forth. And of course, within the church and the authorities, they're very likely to kind of believe and kind of buy into this. So they are valuable and valued, but they're vulnerable. And that's a kind of really useful kind of point of understanding. So KCM says also cunning woman's role in getting rid of unwanted babies in sense of male patriarchy. I mean, absolutely, of course, long before any form of kind of contraception happened, inconvenient pregnancies, dealing with such things is as old as the hills, right? So being a practitioner in these areas, of course, led you wide open to all manner of accusations. And of course, if the church got hold of these, then of course you could be in a very, very dark place very, very quickly. As Lady says, very easy to scapegoat, absolutely. And of course, with add to this sort of superstition and so forth, and things can snowball very, very quickly. So at Malkin Tower, young Janet lived with her grandmother, old Demdike, her mother Elizabeth, and her older sister and brother, Alison and James. There was no adult men around. Elizabeth's husband had died 11 years earlier, and 9-year-old Janet was not his child. She grew up knowing she was the runt of the litter and the bastard daughter of the house. And I think that would have made her feel isolated and different, even cursed. In later investigations, it became clear that Janet's world was populated by demons. Now, Janet's grandmother was not the only cunning woman in the neighbourhood. Old Chattox, the hero of Old Chattox, the head of a nearby house, was a rival for her business, and the devisers believed that Old Chattox was a witch. For some years, Elizabeth's husband had been making payments of oatmeal to Chattox, and the year the payment was not made, he died. Now, at most times in history, such family squabbles would have passed by unnoticed, but these were unusual times. In and around 1600, as a country in the grip of conversion experience, so conversion, of course, from Catholicism to Protestantism, because officially would turn to Protestantism about 40 years before, but that had taken actually about 2 generations to sink in. So, you know, it's not an instant thing, you know, sort of saying, oh, we converted. because, of course, in dark corners a long way from kind of, the rules and the view of the church, people carried on with the old kind of belief systems and the old kind of practices. So consequently, even though this is going to start in the sort of 1540s, 1550s, 1560s, 1570s, gradually kind of stepping up, by about kind of 1600, it's only really kind of now that the kind of grip of Protestantism has really kind of caught on, that's kind of capturing, if you like, the national mood, so that suddenly, we've got far more puritanical perspectives. We've got kind of far more kind of harder takes, if you like, do you know what I mean, on not only what forms the Protestant belief system, but also how you deal with Catholics that are refusing to kind of join in with, if you like, the kind of national mood. So, this is a dangerous time. It's a dangerous time. And people are very, very easy to believe the worst, because England is Protestant now, so Catholics are increasingly feared as kind of seditious and evil. So, witchcraft, Catholic, it's not as far as you kind of think. And the idea that there's kind of people out in Lancashire, a long way from London, that were adhering to old religious ways can be transferred quite easily to the idea that these people are actually dangerous kind of dissenters who need to be suppressed. So to devout English Protestants, the Bible kind of brackets idolaters, heathens, sorcerers together, all in the kind of same band. Okay? And so Catholicism, which to Protestants is a demonic religion, can come to look very, very closely like witchcraft. So therein is the danger. And there was a kind of nervy, apprehensive times at court in London and throughout the country. And in that climate of fear, it didn't take much to arouse suspicion. On March the 18th, 1612, Janet's teenage sister, Alison Device, was out and about, walking down a lane. Along the way, she met a peddler, so as a travelling salesman, okay? And being a beggar, she asked the peddler for some pins. But he wouldn't open his pack, and he walked on. Now, for Alison, this would have been an everyday experience. Probably several times a week, people would brush past her or ignore her, and she'd probably respond to their rudeness by cursing them. On March the 18th, 1612, she cursed the peddler, and the curse seemed to work, because he fell to the floor, and unable to speak or move, he was eventually carried to a local inn. Alison was terrified because she knew she'd bewitched him. She rushed to his bedside and begged for his forgiveness. And from the legal records that we have, the description of the peddler's condition is very precise following his collapse. Now then, tell me what these symptoms suggest to you. So this is from the transcript. His head is drawn away, his eyes and face deformed, his speech not well to be understood, his arms lame, especially the left side. So we've got loss of speech, paralysis down one side of the body, and his eyes kind of aren't following. So I'll give you a second. What does that say to you in terms of Kathy's got? It's a stroke, isn't it? The guy's had a stroke. So I think kind of listening to those symptoms, there's kind of very little difficulty in saying, he had a stroke. The kind of face being awry, the speech problems, the left arm not working, and so like something coming on that suddenly can only really be a stroke. Okay, so Alison seems convinced she's responsible for his stroke through bewitching him, and blamed herself and agonised over it. So we must consider whether there's any kind of logic to Alison's belief. And from the description, it does seem that the two events were significantly linked. So lots you can say in stroke, I completely agree. So looking at it through modern eyes, it does seem that the curse caused him to be very upset. That upset pushes blood pressure up and caused him to have a stroke. It could be mirrored today, couldn't it? In an incident of road rage, an argument, a devastating piece of medical information being given to somebody. So, Leslie's saying nothing to do with the curses. Of course, it may be the curses cause the upset which leads to it, but of course it's not the cause of the curse, is it? The curse is the precursor, if you like, to it. It's a bodily reaction to upset and stress, isn't it? And so forth. So whatever the actual reason is, it seems clear that Alison seems certain she nearly killed a man, and perhaps she nearly had. And it was her fear and a kind of contrition that would lead directly to her kind of downfall, and that of all her family as well. The consequence of Alison's curse spiraled out of control when the peddler's outraged son reported the incident to an ambitious local magistrate, Roger Noel. Now, England's legal justice system is based on justices of the peace dotted around the country, and they are the men that dispense the law. Some of them are not very good, some are lazy, some are extremely zealous, and Roger Noel is one of these zealous types. And of course, he is fiercely Protestant, and some footage here of the church at the end of it. You will see Roger Noel commemorated in the window. So Roger Noel is the magistrate now kind of called upon. He's ambitious, he's a Protestant, and he sees that his success, his kind of root success in his career as a magistrate, is to go out there and identify nonconformists. And that could be witches, it could be Catholics, and then bring them to justice. So Roger Noel begins investigating. He interviewed Alison Device, who, in a kind of need to unburden herself, confesses to everything. But she also accused her neighbour Chattox of bewitching and killing 4 people and of making clay figures. Now, Alison seems to have been seriously spooked by what was done to the peddler. I think it's kind of pretty likely that her little sister Janet would have been freaked out by it too. So Alison's statement escalated the situation. Chattox and her daughter were very ready to point the finger back at the Device family and accuse Granny Demdike, Elizabeth, of witchcraft too. So Noel realised he was no longer investigating a single incident, but was now heading up a major witch hunt, rooting the evil out of Pendle. On April 2nd, 1612, Noel made his first arrests. Janet's sister and her granny, as well as her neighbours Chattox and Annie, were all shipped off to a distant Lancaster castle to await trial. Roger Noel was confident these arrests would please the king. Now, just a year before the arrests in Pendle, the King James Bible was published, and it laid out in stark words, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Now, King James I has a kind of avid reputation of a witch hunter, and he participates personally in trials in North Berwick, and he believes fervently that witches are trying to kill him. In fact, witches tried to sink the boat that was bringing his wife, Anne of Denmark, back from their honeymoon. So he personally authors an exciting book called Demonology, which is unique amongst heads of states in being solely authored work on the nature of hell and what to do about it. And it's pretty popular. It's readable, it's learned, it's concise. It's actually a rather clever piece of work, and it's going to mandate to the British to hunt witches. In the frontispiece of the original 1597 copy, it says at the beginning, "Because of the fearful abounding at this time in this country of these detestable slaves of the devil, the witches or enchanters." James is very much a product of the kind of Presbyterian Kirk of Scotland. He's educated by Presbyterian ministers in an attempt to counteract the influence of his Catholic mother, Mary Queen of Scots. And they told him stories all day about the power of the devil to deliberately scare him. And it works. You can scare a child quite easily. And they talked him into believing he's surrounded by witches. Now, the demonology might seem like the ramblings of a paranoid man. But as the saying goes, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't out to get you. The religious tensions in England had reached boiling points just 7 years earlier, when the king and his entire parliament had very nearly been blown up by Guy Fawkes and the other insurgents in the failed Gunpowder Plot. And although Fawkes had been captured, some of the conspirators were still at large. So it's kind of perfectly reasonable for an early modern monarch to be paranoid about people that are trying to kill you. And where James is concerned, there's a huge number of conspirators out there. He's got a dad who's been strangled after an attempt to blow him up, another relative whose head has been hacked off in an English prison, and there have been 2 attempts to kidnap him, and maybe 1 to murder him. So no wonder he's scared, and shortly after his arrival in England, a number of Catholics try and blow him up and Parliament to smithereens. It's no wonder he's exceptionally nervous about conspiracy. The plotters who were caught were trying to flee to safety, and the place where they expected to find it was in Lancashire. So in March 1612, local magistrates had received an order from London that they were to compile a report of those who refused to take communion in church in an effort to kind of root out the Lancashire Catholics. It was a kind of crude but hopefully effective loyalty test, and it said, all those that do not come to the church and there communicate must be presented and further proceeded against. Fail not herein at your peril. So the command was basically go to Lancashire and root out the nonconformists, the Catholics. And who was one of those signatures? It was Roger Nowell. So he felt very much, this magistrate, he was very much working at the King's behest. And there's no question about it. On Good Friday 1612, every loyal subject should have been in the church. So they were commanded to go and attend a Protestant service for Good Friday. Instead, at Malkin Tower, Janet's mother threw a party, and to feed the guests, her brother had stolen a sheep. Of course, there would have been friends absent from the gathering. Alison and Granny Demdike, along with the neighbours, were now awaiting trial in Lancaster Castle. But what happened in that house on that day would become the subject of intense scrutiny over the following months. There were guests at Mocking Tower, but was it just an Easter party? Friends round for lunch? Was it a solidarity meeting for the relatives of those held prisoner in Lancaster Castle? Or was it a gathering of witches? The local constable hears a whisper there is a meeting of witches at Mocking Tower, and he arrives suddenly at the door with his men. Now afterwards, with echoes of the Gunpowder Plot, they'd be accused of conspiring to blow up Lancaster Castle and to murder its jailer. Everyone present but the family at Mocking Tower did not come quietly. They told the constable there'd be more people at the party that had left already. You'll never guess who you just missed, they say. And so the others implicated were also arrested. They were all accused of plotting to kill a man with witchcraft. By the time that Nowell had finished, he'd sent another 8 people during the original 4 into Lancaster Castle. It was all going so much better than you could have hoped. Now, unlike some of the people detained, Janet Device was definitely at Mocking Tower on Good Friday in 1612, but she wasn't taken away with the others. The child wasn't jailed. The people rounded up at the party were all from the lowest possible walks of life, but the others arrested were different. Alice Nutter was from a respectable landowning family and was arrested along with her sister-in-law, her nephew and a friend. The Nutters are still in the area. Now, there aren't many Nutters in Yorkshire, but there's quite a few in this corner of Lancashire. And the question of how respectable Alice Nutter gets caught up in the witch trials seems to be the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, it is clear to imagine Nowell, the investigator's motivation. The Nutters were a powerful Catholic family, and Noel was keen to curry favours with the king and the powers that be by catching Catholics along with the witches. She had two relatives to Alice Nutter who were priests who'd been hung, drawn and quartered, one of them at Tyburn and one in Lancaster. But as far as Noel was concerned, she's just another one of these troublemaking Catholics. She was used as a pawn for Noel's own ends. And it seems pretty unlikely to me that Alice Nutter and her friends spent Good Friday eating stolen mutton at shit towers with the local beggars. But whatever the truth was, they were rounded up, arrested and transported to Lancaster Castle. One of the arrested women was not sent to Lancaster Castle. Janet Preston, who was alleged to have been present at Mocking Tower on Good Friday, was a resident of Gisborne. It's now in Lancashire, but at that time it was in Craven in Yorkshire. As a result, she was tried separately from the other so-called witnesses. Her trial took place in York, a month before the assizes in Lancaster. Now, incredibly, this was not the first time that Janet Preston had stood trial for witchcraft in York. In 1612, Janet Preston was probably a woman in her 40s. The Gisborne Parish Church Register lists a marriage of Janet Balderson to William Preston 25 years earlier on the 10th of May 1587. Now, later in her life, she was employed as a housekeeper to Thomas Lister at Westby Hall, and by all accounts was made very welcome in his home. And it's believed that she also became his mistress. So Lister dies in 1608, but his son, who's also called Thomas, continued to employ Janet. But then in early 1612, she appears before the Lent Assizes at York Court, accused of witchcraft and causing the death of one Dodgson's child. So Janet stood before Judge Bromley and was acquitted by the jury. So Janet Preston had already been acquitted of murder and witchcraft. However, her fate was sealed when only days after her acquittal in York, she was found to be one of the many attending the Good Friday party at Malkin Tower. Having come through one crazed and irrational prosecution, she stood in the dock again a few months later, accused of the death of Thomas Lister Sr. Janet had had the misfortune to be present at a meeting that led to the arrest of those present and accused them of witchcraft. The case of Janet Preston is another pertinent example of how this underlying concern with improper sexual conduct played a role in the 1612 trials. The charge against Janet Preston being, I quote, "She feloniously had practised, used and exercised diverse wicked and devilish arts called witchcrafts, enchantments, charms and sorceries in and upon Thomas Lister of Westbury in Craven. She was accused of enlisting the help of the devisers to help her carry it out." Now, unlike Elizabeth Southerns and Elizabeth Device, there's no examples of Janet being mocked or ostracised by her community for her sexual conduct. There's no accusations of being illegitimate children or having illicit affairs. Nonetheless, a careful reading the lines of the court transcript paints a picture of the undesirable, even dangerous behaviour which probably contributed to Janet's downfall. The court clerk, a guy called Thomas Potts, remember that name, takes great pains to stress that, we quote, "Janet was for many years well thought of and esteemed by Master Lister, and had access to his house, kind respect and entertainment." Indeed, Potts says nothing was denied her that she stood in need of. Everyone knew it. He says, "Which of you that dwelleth near them in Craven, but can and will witness it?" So Potts' words were intended to demonstrate how kindly the gentleman looked after her. He's kind of cruelly tricked by an evil witch who repaid his generosity with her callous and ungodly actions. Yet they kind of portray something much deeper. Behind Potts' moral posturing, we get a sense of a close, long-standing relationship between Master Lister and Janet. And this begs an inevitable question. Was this simply a wealthy man doting on a servant, or something more? Was Jenna in fact his mistress? And the plot thickens when we consider Master Lister's dying words. I quote, "When Master Lister lay upon his deathbed, he cried out in great extremity, 'Janet Preston lays heavily upon me. Preston's wife lays heavy upon me.' In front of the York Assizes, these words were interpreted as an accusation. Master Lister, as he lay dying, had told everyone exactly who had caused his demise. But was that the real meaning? Or could he have been calling out for the one he loved, the one he wanted to lay his weakening eyes upon just one last time? Or was he stricken with guilt at conducting an extramarital affair with Janet? His panicked words, some form of kind of dying confession. Whatever it was, we can imagine the kind of public humiliation for his family, his wife and his children, when news of his dying words spread. So in his community, it would have been far more comfortable to interpret them as a denouncement of a witch than as the long-held affection for an absent lover. Of course, we'll never know for certain. But what is interesting is that whilst there's evidence may kind of point to a sexual relationship between the two, it's never explicitly expressed in Potts' record of the trial. Unlike some of her counterparts, any reference to Janet's sexual behaviour is skillfully avoided, undoubtedly due to the sensitivities around the fact there was an esteemed gentleman involved in the case. Poor uneducated women were reasonable targets to be scorned for their sexual conduct. Wealthy men were another matter entirely. The prosecutor, get this, was none other than the dead man's son. Thomas Lister Jr. was convinced that Jenna had bewitched his father so much that he died as a result. The extension of this being, she'd also bewitched him to take part in sexual activity. Lister's son may have seen as an inconvenience to be rid of and to preserve kind of his father's good name. Getting a charge with hanged for witchcraft would be perfect, as it would appear that Thomas Sr. had been bewitched by his scheming housekeeper and therefore innocent of any infidelity. So with Lister as a prosecutor and his father-in-law Thomas Heber as the presiding magistrate, it seems the die was cast for Janet. She was found guilty of murder and witchcraft and was hanged in York in July 1612, the first of the Pendle Witches to die. So, of course, the rest of the Pendle Witches are in Lancaster Castle. Let's have a look at that now. So whether the prisoners in Lancaster, locked up in Lancaster Castle, knew about Janet, we don't really know. It's not a matter of record. But a kind of extraordinary twist in this story. The clerk of the Yorkshire Assizes, one Thomas Potts, who'd been present through the trial of Janet Preston, left his job and presented himself at Lancaster Castle, and he's promptly hired. So Lancaster Castle remained a working prison up till 2012, and a section of it is still known as the Witch's Tower we're looking at. The castle is huge, but the cell they were held in wasn't. Inside were all of Janet's family, her gran, her mother, her brother, her sisters, all the neighbours, Chattocks, Anne, Isabel Roby, Margaret Pearson, Alice Nutter, Margaret Pearson, John and Jane Bullock, and Catherine Hewitt, plus 8 other prisoners, in a space of 20 feet by 12 feet, 20 people in all. As for Janet, we don't know where she spent the 4 months that her family was imprisoned. It's possibly lived under the protection of Roger Nowell, as she was about to become crucial to the case he was building. The magistrate would have been well aware of the king's thoughts on witch hunting. Right at the end of his demonology book, King James wrote something that became especially relevant in the case of Pendle. It was, in my opinion, bards or wives are never so defamed persons. That's children, women, and liars all kind of lumped together. May of our law serve for sufficient witnesses and proofs in the matter of high treason against God. So that's Nowell. That's telling Nowell and other magistrates in the country 2 really important things. Witchcraft is treason, not just against the king, but by extension also against God himself. And secondly, he's saying the law should allow children to testify in court. But it wasn't just Noel that was influenced by King James's demonology. It was also an influence on the professional justice system. So we mentioned Thomas Potts. We can see now in this next video the account of his trial. So everything we know about this whole story comes from this one book, The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster, written by one Thomas Potts, while serving as clerk to the court when the prisoners went on trial in 1612. He kept all his notes of the trial and wrote them all up to demonstrate the rigour of the trial proceedings. He'd also dedicated the book to his patron, Thomas Knivet, and Knivet was the man who arrested Guy Fawkes. So Potts was making a clear connection for the readers between the witches and the Catholics as traitors or terrorists. The whole book is an exercise in political brown-nosing, but nonetheless it represents an extraordinarily detailed account of the 17th century witch trial. In the courtroom of Lancaster Castle on 18th of August 1612, the trial of the Pendle Witches begins. The court is still a working courtroom, but in 1612, it wouldn't look precisely as it does in the next video. Nonetheless, there was a judge, actually two judges in this case, and a jury of witnesses and defendants. And all the while, Thomas Potts was scribbling verbatim notes that would become his best-selling book. The outcome of the trial was far from being a foregone conclusion. At this time, believe it or not, fewer than half of the accused witches ended up being convicted and executed. And the set of records that we have indicates something like a 75% acquittal rate. So whatever the odds for Janet's sister, whose curses start the whole affair, things didn't look good. Poor Alison Device didn't even want to defend herself. This is the woman who thought she cursed the guy with the stroke, right? She's completely convinced of her own guilt. Her words had caused the peddler to collapse, and that terrified her. She was asked in court if through her magic powers she could restore the peddler back to health and strength. But regretfully, she said she couldn't. But she did say, and others agreed with her, that her grandmother would have been able to help him. But in the 4 months of waiting for the trial to begin, Granny Demdike had died in the tiny, filthy cell at Lancaster. So Thomas Potts had some sympathy for Alison. He liked his witches kind of desperate and contrite. But unfortunately, her mother was neither, and Potts was vile about it. He wrote, "This odious witch was branded a prosperous mark in nature which left her left eye standing lower than her other, the one looking down, the other looking up, so strangely deformed that the best that were there present did affirm they'd not often seen the like." So 400 years ago, it wasn't common for a witness to be brought into court itself to testify. So this is now footage from Lancaster courtroom, Preston courtroom. But on the 18th of August 1612, a star witness was being prepared to take the stand. Elizabeth Device was furious and protested innocence. But their 9-year-old daughter, Janet, was brought in to testify against her. Elizabeth was distraught, and she yelled at her desperately. Janet burst into tears. She was only a little girl after all, turning to the judge and asking that her mother be taken away before she would be able to speak. Once Elizabeth had been silenced and Janet had her audience, she jumped upon the table and calmly denounced her mother as a witch. We'll never know why Janet Davis said what she said, and these days the courts will be very sensitive in the handling of young people, especially in such an intimidating environment. Janet Davis said what she said, but standing on a table centre stage in the middle of this moral and political and legal drama, I can't help but think that she was there reciting her lines. She said, "My mother is a witch, and that I know to be true. I have seen her spirit in the likeness of a brown dog, which she calls Bull. The dog would ask what she would have him do, and she answered that she would have him help her kill John Robinson of Barley, James Robinson, and Henry Mitten. Janet went on to describe the meeting at Malkin Tower on Good Friday. She said, "At 12 noon, about 20 people came to our house. My mother told me they were all witches." She described the food they ate and named 6 people she'd seen there whose names she knew, as well as a mother and brother. There's a kind of paradox surrounding the evidence of children in the courtroom. On the one hand, they seem unreliable because they're so young, but on the other, they're seen as kind of pure witnesses of the truth. So there's something quite horrific about exploiting Janet Davis, who's so young, and I think people may have thought that at the time too. But at the same time, she could be the only means of cracking open this secret ring of witchcraft. It wasn't just Janet who testified against Elizabeth. Her son James denounced her too. He said that 3 skulls had been robbed from graves at the new church at Pendle, and 4 of the teeth kept at Malkin Tower. 4 teeth were then presented in the court that had been found at Malkin Tower by a constable with a clay figure, all buried together in the ground. But giving evidence against his mother wouldn't help him because Janet's brother had turned on her own brother too. So Janet said that James had been a witch for 3 years. She'd seen his spirit kill 3 people. And she went on to recite charms that she'd heard her brothers use. She quoted, "Upon Good Friday I will fast while I may. A cross of blue and another of red, as good Lord was to the rude. Gabriel laid him down to sleep on the ground, that I can neither sleep nor wake. Rise up, Gabriel, sweet Jesus, our Lord. Amen." So what we seem to have here is a series of half understood, maybe even a quarter understood recollections of prayers, practices, and kind of rites of popular Catholicism, and a bit of play text all swirled together in something that would sound impressive to a listener as a healing charm. Potts was impressed by Janet's testimony, in fact seemed to relish her calm and clear and chilling account. Although she were but very young, he said, yet it was wonderful to the court with what modesty, government and understanding she delivered this evidence against the prisoner at the bar being her own natural brother. An adult would know what they were saying would lead to the mum and grandma being hanged. And I don't think Janet knew in the way that an adult would know. She only knew it intellectually, and that's not emotionally, and that's why I think her mother screams at her in the way that she does. I think her mother is desperately trying to make her kind of realise what she's done. She's clearly rather an odd child. She's clearly very articulate. She clearly doesn't like her family. She's rather kind of different to others in the family. We don't know who her father was. She's the only illegitimate child. And clearly she's either really terrified of the magistrates or determined to save herself at all costs. Or more probably, it gives her a chance of sorts for concealed resentments and animosities against her father, and these can explode lethally. I think we need to imagine that she believes in the reality of witchcraft and that these people really are witches, and she seeks to distance herself from them. Of course, she's also put under a great deal of pressure. It may be direct pressure, it may be just the atmospheric pressure of the courtroom. The tension of all these men around her, telling her, in fact, that witchcraft has taken place and that she's the linchpin in punishing it. So it wasn't just her kind of own family that Janet was prepared to denounce as witches. Alice Nutter and her friends, all very well-to-do, as we know, and the judge was more demanding of evidence against them. He arranged identity parades, mixing them with other prisoners from the castle, and one by one Janet picked them out. "You were there on Good Friday," she said to one. "You had on the prettiest dress to another. You ate the mutton to a third. You were sitting right by me." In an attempt to catch her out, the judge said, "Did you see Joanna Style, a made-up name?" "No, sir, I've never heard of her." Most of the kind of early modern witch hunters rely on the Bible or monographs by the kind of great continental demonologists of their texts. The Lancashire witch trials are really unusual in that they kind of ignore pretty much completely these and fasten instead onto the King's own book, King James's Demonology. And it was this way it's kind of extremely rare, and that they're kind of plainly ticking boxes. King James says witches use body parts for evil magic, and body parts are found at the Lancashire witches' property. They make clay images, states King James, and again these are found in the Surge. Most notably, King James states children are incredibly useful as witnesses, and suddenly we have Janet. So what these people are doing is looking upwards to the monarch as their kind of fount of wisdom. The evidence against the prisoners had stacked up perfectly. We tend to assume that witchcraft was just one big delusion, and therefore that the witches were convicted, were kind of in fact innocent. But accused witches believed in witchcraft too. And I think it's improbable to think that the witches never tried to use magic in order to kill somebody. Well, today we prosecute and punish people if they attempt a crime but are unsuccessful. So, if we think about the witch of 1612, by that measure, were they actually innocent? By the end of the two-day trial, the jury decided that all of Janet's family and most of her neighbours were guilty of causing death or harm by witchcraft, and 10 people were sentenced to hang. Elizabeth Devis, Alison Devis, James Devis, Anne Whittle, Anne Redfern, Isabel Roby, Alice Nutter, Jane Bullock, John Bullock, and Catherine Hewitt. The day after the trial, the 10 convicted prisoners were brought to a place still known as Gallows Hill, which is what you were looking at, by the way, when we got policy violations, so now playground. And this was kind of sort of piece of state theatre, and this was kind of the majesty of God and the majesty of law kind of focused on this one event, and everyone could see the power of this mass execution. At the critical moment, the witch was led out, forced to climb the ladder. The noose was put over her neck, and at that moment the crowd went rather quiet. They didn't die, though, from having their necks broken. They died from slow strangulation that might take as long as 20 minutes. Back then, there's a kind of account of friends and family coming forward to pull on the legs of a poor person being executed in order to hasten their end. Condemned prisoners were expected to make one final confession. It was the last chance to save their souls, though not, of course, their lives. And we're told that Elizabeth and Alice Nutter never confessed, not even with their dying words. I think it's probably very likely, based on the standards of the day, that Janet would have been encouraged to be there too. A lot of history's most ghastly locations are completely transformed now, but this space that I showed you remains as an open green space and a play park which has served generations of children. So there's a kind of dark irony that the last thing Elizabeth may have seen as she looked out from the gallows was her child, Janet, whose testimony had brought her to this place. We don't know anything about what happened to the orphan Janet Devis in the years following her execution of her entire family and most of her neighbours. It's difficult to imagine anybody wanting to take her in, but it could be argued that they weren't her last victims. Thanks to Potts' published account, Janet's influence would travel far beyond Lancashire. Although there have been earlier cases of children being heard as witnesses in witch trials, the law stated that children under 14 were not credible witnesses, as they could not be sworn under oath. But that was set to change. So let me show you, hopefully this won't get me back into trouble. Let me show you the Dalton Magistrates Guide. So imagine you're a 17th century Justice of the Peace or magistrate. You're not trained in the law like judges are, but you need to investigate, interrogate witnesses, and compile a case for the assize. What you need is one handy book that gives you all the basics. Something you can just pull off the shelf whenever you need it. The Country Justice is that book, and it was by a man called Dalton, and it was first published in 1618. This was the handbook that was used by all the magistrates, both here and in the colonies of America. You've got some people accused of witchcraft, and so you look for advice on witnesses, and here it is. For the children in the book, it says, The Discovery of Witches at Lancaster Assizes, Thomas Potts' book, that the son and daughter, that's Janet and James of Elizabeth Device, a witch. One is about 9 years and the other about 14, did upon their oaths give open evidence against their mother, then prisoner at the bar. So what Janet did in 1612 ended up giving a precedent to magistrates, not just here, but across the Atlantic, to seek the testimony of children in trials of witchcraft. And before we say that's outrageous, let's remember that today there's still trials which rely on child testimony due to lack of alternative witnesses. What is truly, truly, truly strange is that then Janet herself becomes the victim of this precedent. The standing trial for witchcraft, a child's evidence is used to secure a conviction. So, in November 1633, 21 years after the 9-year-old Janet testified against her family, a 10-year-old boy from Pendle came home late one evening and told his parents a very strange story. Edmund Robinson explained that the reason he'd been late is that he'd been out picking berries. And while he'd been gathering berries, he said that he'd seen 2 greyhounds. In his words now, I tried to get them to chase a hare, but they didn't run. So I beat them with a stick. One of the dogs turned into a witch, and the other into a boy. And then she turned him into a horse. The witch that took me away on the horse to that house Horsestones, and their barn was full of witches, maybe 60 of them. And from the ceiling there were all these ropes hanging down, and they were pulling on the ropes, and amazing food came falling down. I was so frightened I ran away, and they chased me for ages, and before I get home I met a boy with cloven hooves. So I fought him, and that's why I'm so scruffy. It's not my fault. All of which seem to have been accepted as a kind of genuine reason for lateness, and somewhat surprisingly, after hearing his story, the boy's father took him from village to stand in the churches and to point to witches that he'd seen there. And this happens over kind of 3 months. So week after week after week, he goes around identifying people as this coven that he comes across. So the curate of a local church, one of these that witnessed it, described it as this and said, the boy was brought into the church of Kildwick and was set on a stall to look all around him, which moved some little disturbance in the congregation for a while. And after prayers, people told me he was the boy that discovered witches. On the evidence of Edmund's bizarre story about 20 people, who were on the evidence of this, 20 people were imprisoned, and they were put on trial in February of 1634. And one of them was called Janet Devis, and she was accused of killing Isabel, the wife of William Nutter. Now, as with all things, we need to be careful to ensure we're talking about the same individual. Janet, after all, may have moved or been sent away after the trial. However, there's no reason not to suppose that this isn't the same Janet Devis from the earlier Lancashire trial that's accused by an Edmund Robinson. The fact that someone with the same name is a suspect in the second trial, with some of the same families involved in the same place, is very suggestive. So I really think there's no reason not to suspect her. I don't know if you remember, but one of the women executed was Alice Nutter. So she's now accused Janet Devis of having overseen the execution of Alice Nutter. She is now responsible for the death of Isabel, wife of William Nutter. So, same family, same place, same people, same cast of characters. It really is remarkable. And again, it's the stories that the children tell that have this incredible power. Not only in Edmund's story in 1633, but in the words that Janet used back in 1612 that had come back to haunt her. Because she'd been a witness for the Crown as a 9-year-old and had been spared the noose. But surely, this time, she'd hang. But these were very different times, and England had changed since 1612. When we kind of look back on the 16th century, we think of a lot of things that happened before, the 17th century. Before the 17th century, we think of a world where witches were persecuted, where people relied on what other people said, everyone was superstitious, everyone was uncertain. It was a kind of great period of religious and political uncertainty. But then jump forward to the 18th century, you've got order and stability. So the 17th century is kind of transition between one and the old world and the new. So when Thomas Potts kind of wrote his book, he thought he'd be pleasing the king, King James I, with his account, because James was very interested, of course, in witchcraft. He'd written the book Demonology. But James kind of continued interest in witch trials, led him to become more sceptical. So something very important had happened in Leicester in 1616. A boy, maybe 12 or 13 years old, claims he's been bewitched. The case goes to trial, and as a result of this, 9 women are hanged. The following month, King James I goes to Leicester. He interviews the boy himself and discovers he's lying. As a result of this, the judges are very, very kind of soundly rebuked. And this, of course, then goes out to a message to other judges to be very, very cautious in witchcraft cases, particularly when of course, your star witness happens to be a child. And by the time Edmund told his story in 1633, there was now a new king on the throne. Charles I, son of James, had replaced his father. And he's even more doubtful about witch hunting than his father had become. But also his attitude to religion was very, very different. If you remember, in 1612, we've got this big crackdown on Catholics. You know, it's only 7 years after the Gunpowder Plot. And Noel, the magistrate, is just as keen to rope in sort of recalcitrant Catholics, the Catholics that are kind of carrying on their faith. So Alice Nutter, we know, is certainly one of this category. A well-to-do lady, but a Catholic, practicing in secret. So he wasn't bothered which Catholic, all the same, right? His job is to root out those that aren't good Protestants. So consequently, the view towards Catholics changes dramatically with the arrival of King Charles I, because he's married to one. He's married to Queen Henrietta Maria. So consequently, the view now towards Catholics at the level of the king is much more benign. And he also doesn't really believe that witchcraft is a serious threat to the state. So that's the kind of context, obviously, going into the trial. And at that time, obviously, you know, the most radical Protestants, the people we call Puritans, they are the killjoys, the ones that you know, kind of went off and founded America, or at least played a huge role in kind of founding some of the colonies in America, were of course obsessed with the devil and the demons. But Charles, as a king, is deeply suspicious of Puritanism. He's pretty kind of suspicious as well of these accounts of demons. So here we are then, back 22 years later. We're in the same courtroom in Preston, and just as before, the jury listened to a child telling stories of witches, but this time Jenna isn't a witness. Jenna is in the dock. And just as before, the jury believed the child to be honest and the prisoners to be evil. On Edmund's testimony, 17 people were found guilty and should have been sentenced to death. But in this new kind of England, this changed England, the judges weren't happy with these verdicts, and the matter was referred to London, to the King, and to the Privy Council. So 4 were sent from Lancashire to London, but not Janet. She stays behind in Lancaster Castle, where several prisoners had already died of jail fever during the 15 months they'd spent there. So London in 1634 would have been a real another world for these women of Lancashire. When they arrived, the 4 were held in Fleet Jail. And while they were there, a pair of playwrights immediately produced a play called, The Witches of Lancashire, featuring the story told by little Edmund. They got the play on the stage so quickly that while the women were behind bars, on show to the public for a penny or two, the piece was already being performed. So you could go watch the play in the afternoon, and in the evening go and see the women in jail themselves. 2 forms of entertainment. So Londoners could go to the jail, have a good gawp at the witches, and then go and see the play, or vice versa. It's the kind of complete entertainment package of the 17th century. And the power of kind of storytelling never ceases to amaze me. The lad tells these tall tales in Lancashire, and the next minute is a play in London. It's interesting knowing that in 1634, even though most people still believe in witches, they're now able to laugh at them as part of an entertainment, and that wouldn't have happened in 1612. So this new way of looking at the world was also apparent in the advances being made by scientists, which would over the century transform our understanding of nature. Scientific research and experimentation did not banish a belief in witchcraft and superstition overnight. Far from it. But it did provide us a serious tools to try to tell the innocent from the guilty. And so these were applied in 1634 to the women of Lancashire accused of witchcraft. And this is one of the very earliest uses of what came to be known as forensic science. In other words, science that relates to the law courts. The 1612 trial represents a kind of older way of thinking where everything is based on credulity, superstition, everyone's willing to believe everything kind of nasty that was said. But by the time you get to 1634, although it's by no means a kind of scientific era, it seems people are behaving in a more rational way. And they're demanding to see what we would think of as scientific or forensic objective evidence. What is shifting in the 17th century slowly and by kind of fits and starts is a belief that you have to demonstrate something physically. That if you can't demonstrate it in medicine, you can't use it as evidence. In other words, there may be invisible words of spirits around you, but you have to prove physical effect in order to bring them into a law court. So King James had written his demonology that one good way to look for a witch is to look for witches' marks. Teats, you'll have heard of these, I'm sure. A place on the body where you could see a teat that had been used to suckle by the devil, because this was the belief that the devils would come and suckle them, or your familiars. So all the accused people from Lancashire were examined for these marks, including Janet herself. And the records, they say, found Janet Devis, 2 paps or marks in her secrets. And I think secrets means exactly what you think that it means. The other 4 people brought to London also had their marks listed. So Margaret Johnson, 1 mark or pap betwixt her seat and her secrets. Now, King Charles wanted his own trusted physician, William Harvey, to re-examine the women. And William Harvey is one of the greatest kind of medical medics of history, if you like. He's known for discovering how the blood circulates through the body. And he takes his place kind of up there with people like Isaac Newton and Christopher Wren as one of the new kind of forward-thinking people of the 17th century. The people that are dragging the ancient world of superstition into modernity. And they're kind of plugging into a European will to do things better than before. So Harvey was sent on more than one occasion to examine the witches on the king's orders. There was a village witch who had a toad as her familiar, not a kind of unfamiliar situation. And William Harvey caught the toad, dissected the toad, and then showed the dissection to the witch to prove to her that it was just a normal toad, that there was nothing supernatural about it. And the woman flew at him and virtually tried to tear his skin off with her nails. "You've killed my toad!" she screamed. She wasn't the slightest bit grateful that he brought science and rationality to her aid. From her point of view, he'd killed her pet and probably removed the foundation stone of her business. In London, then, Harvey recruits 5 physicians and 10 female midwives conduct the examination. And this time, all the previous suspicious marks were deemed to be nothing unnatural. And of course, bearing in mind at this time, people had all sorts of skin complaints, tags and so forth, and what's that other one? I can't think what they call them. Little polyps and all these kind of things that just occur sort of naturally on people's bodies. So of course it's rather unfortunate, if you're going to find these things. Witch's mark, witch's teat. So this is, what they kind of do. And it's kind of through this methodology that witch hunting, in effect, becomes undone. It's not so much people going straight to the core and saying they don't believe in witchcraft. It's people saying we need to be much, much more careful about how we prosecute, because standards of evidence need to be raised. And if you raise the standard of proof high enough in witch trials, eventually they come to an end, because most of them are, Not factual, are they? Let's be honest. A pile, says Dawn, exactly. So according to William Harvey and his scientific team, there's no physical evidence against any of these prisoners. So everything now rests solely on the evidence of the child. In 1612, Janet Davis had been unflappable in court, cool and consistent. But in 1634, under examination from the Privy Council and the Secretary of State, 10-year-old Edmund Robinson cracked. He said that the story he told was inspired by stories he'd heard about the Davis family. He'd heard the neighbours talk of a witch feast that was kept at Mocking Tower at Pendle Forest about 20 years previously. And cross-questioning established that Edmund's father had been blackmailing the women, getting his son to accuse any who refused to pay. The Robinson family had some fine new cows. Janet and the other women prisoners were all acquitted of witchcraft. So for me, this story is remarkable because the tale told by Janet in 1612 had such resonance. It kind of took on a life of its own in Pendle and refused to go away. Edmund accused Janet of witchcraft precisely because her story had been so convincing and so compelling. Her own words were almost the death of her. Since the time of Janet Davis, we've become less credulous of magic and more rigorous in our demand for empirical evidence. And in our kind of modern technological age, we kind of pride ourselves, don't we, on our rationality, our scientific understanding of the world. But some things don't change. Many people still believe in evil. But of course, where the evil occurs tends to change from year to year and from community to community. Child killers, drug dealers, paedophiles, terrorists, many still consider this evil to be the work of the devil. The Church of England continues to perform exorcisms. Now as then we have fear, and at times of crisis, fear still leads to miscarriages of justice. When we hear a story like the Lancashire witch trials from the first half of the 17th century, it's very easy to feel distance from this strange alien world where people believe things that we don't believe, and acted in ways that we might consider to be barbaric. But of course, in the post 9/11 world, in the era of terror, it's still quite easy to build policy on paranoia, and therefore to overreact in certain situations and to infringe on civil liberties in the name of security. Guantanamo Bay being the kind of classic example. People denied of liberty, not put on trial, believed to be guilty of crimes that they were never brought to court for, or if they were caught, they were never sort of there was no form of justice applied that would resonate with us as kind of fair trials. So in situations where we do feel threatened by the enemy within, and that people around us might be trying to undermine Western civilization, we find ourselves behaving in ways that are frighteningly similar, I think, to the ways that some of these people behaved in Pendle in 1612 or 1633. So what about Janet Davis then, the Lancashire child at the heart of this story? Did she walk away from these two witch trials unscathed? Perhaps. In the prison records of 1636, Janet and some of the others acquitted of witchcraft were still imprisoned. Lancaster Castle inmates had to pay for their board and stay until the debt was cleared, which for someone like Janet may have been impossible. There's no more records of Janet Davis after 1636, but we do know that her legacy lived on. 3,000 miles from Lancaster, 19 people were hanged in 1692. These witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts, perhaps the most infamous in history, and most of that evidence was given by children. On the Salem magistrate's table was Dalton's country justice, suggesting children were suitable witnesses in the trial of witches and citing Janet Davis in 1612. So 400 years ago, the idea of witches in one's midst must have been terrifying. But for us Today I think it's the enigma of Janet Davis that we find so disturbing. We'll never know why she said what she said. But that desire to believe her was born out of the kind of wild and irrational fear that can turn neighbour against neighbour, and relative against relative, and can make demons out of all of us. Maybe it's because our protective instincts are so strong and our imagination so powerful that we still struggle to control that fear during times of crisis. Times when the truth can be the hardest thing of all to define. But there's clearly another factor at play here. And again, this has never gone away. And it is misogyny and the negative portrayal of powerful female sexuality. It's an unsurprising find, after all, that even nowadays, the language used to characterise feminine seductive behaviour is often intrinsically linked to witchcraft. If a woman is considered attractive and charming, she was also bewitching, beguiling, and capable of putting men under her spell. In modern Western culture, such language might seem whimsical, or at very worst, irritatingly objectifying. There's many reasons why a woman was considered dangerous enough to be suspected of witchcraft in the 16th and the 17th centuries. And as we've seen in the case of the Pendle Witches, perceptions of a woman's sexual morality undoubtedly played a part in this. At the very least, it's another stick with which to beat them, another way in which their character could be called into question. To the early modern mind, their behaviour was undesirable, even ungodly. Did their loose morals mean they were in league with the devil? At worst, their sexual behaviour became a motive to scorn them as a witch, a convenient, convincing accusation when no other might do. In the early modern period, women who bore children outside of wedlock, or had affairs with another man, or indeed with gentlemen, were seen to be subverting the normal social order. Their behaviour challenged an accepted view of how the world should be and how women should behave within it. This made them, of course, dangerous, and for onlookers in their communities, it begged the question, if they could do this, what else were they capable of? And the powerful imaginations of children would provide the answer. It'd be great to be able to say that the trial of 1633 represents a turning point, but the change was very slow. Witch fever gripped East Anglia for 14 terrible months between 1645 and 1646. The people of these solidly eastern counties were Puritan and rabid anti-Catholics, easily swayed by bigoted preachers whose mission it was to seek out the slightest whiff of heresy. And a man called Matthew Hopkins, an unsuccessful lawyer, came to help. He became known as the Witchfinder General, and he had 68 people put to death in Bury St Edmunds alone, and 19 were hanged at Chelmsford in a single day. After Chelmsford, he set off for Norfolk and Suffolk, and the town of Aldborough paid him £6 for clearing the town of witches. King's Lynn paid him £15. A Grateful Stone Market paid him £23. And this was at a time when the daily wage was 2.5 pence. There's a heart carved on a wall in the marketplace at King's Lynn. It's supposed to mark the spot where the heart of Margaret Reed, a condemned witch who was being burnt at the stake, leapt from the flames and struck the wall. Much of Matthew Hopkins' theories of deduction were based on devil's marks. A wart or a mole or even a flea bite he took to be a devil's mark, and he used his jabbing needle to see if these marks were insensitive to pain. His needle, though, was a 3-inch spike that retracted into a spring-loaded handle. So, of course, as he stabbed it, the spike disappeared. So, of course, he felt no pain. There's other tests for witches. Mary Sutton of Bedford was put to a swimming test. With her thumbs tied in to her opposite big toes, she was flung in the river. If she floated, she was guilty. If she sank, she was innocent. Poor Mary floated. The last kind of reminder of Hopkins' reign of terror was discovered in St Offa's in Essex in 1921. 2 female skeletons were found in a garden, pinned into unmarked graves with iron rivets driven through their joints. And this was to make sure a witch could not return from the grave. In total, Hopkins was responsible for over 300 executions. Many supposed witches were usually old women, invariably poor, and any unfortunate enough to be crone-like, snaggle-toothed, sunken-cheeked, or having a hairy lip were assumed to possess the evil eye. If they also had a cat, this was taken as proof, as witches always had a familiar, and a cat, of course, being the most common amongst them. So many unfortunate women were condemned on this sort of evidence and hanged after undergoing appalling torture. The pilnywinks, or thumbscrews, and iron caspi claws, that form kind of leg irons, heated over a brazier, usually got a confession from the witch. You might as well, indeed, be put to death if you're going to be tortured. So witchcraft was not made a capital offence in Britain until 1563, although it was deemed heresy and denounced by Pope Innocent in 1484. And from 1484, Pope Innocent, of course, head of the Catholic Church, until 1750, some 200,000 witches were tortured, burned, and hanged across Western Europe. 200,000 women executed.